The 1980s was a really pivotal time in South African history. This is the time when the apartheid system um, really began to collapse under its own weight. And much of this was due to the stepped up levels of resistance um, and the organization of the Black Africans under representative bodies, not political parties, because those have been outlawed. Also by I mean, they weren't the only ones protesting. There were a lot of white liberals involved in this. Of course, much of the colored population, the Indian population. In some cases, these groups all work together. So we want to talk about that resistance, talk about some of this organization. In 1983, an organization called the United Democratic Front was founded. This was due to, or this happened at a meeting that brought together the leadership of trade unions, student organizations, women's organizations, and various other um, uh, assemblies of different people in South Africa. It was a very diffuse organization. There was not um, a really defined line that the UDF took up. For one, it was not really a political party. It didn't bill itself that way. It simply was an organization of like-minded people who were interested in calling for change. Right, it had to be careful with its rhetoric. The trade union leaders were probably the most important members of the UDF, but women's organizations, especially, were also very, very active in this. Right. Some members of the UDF, or some who identified with the UDF, called for the outright overthrow of apartheid. Others called for reform of apartheid. Others simply objected to some of the features of apartheid. Right. So there was a broad spectrum of people who came to identify with the UDF: black, colored, Indian, white, all people of all races. Worked with under the umbrella of the UDF. For the most part, though, the leadership of the UDF adhered pretty much to the ANC's rhetoric. They adopted, for instance, the Freedom Charter as a statement of the goals of the organization. This was not well met by the apartheid government. They eventually did declare the UDF illegal, I think, in 1986. But by that point, it had a huge following, right? And so, at least for many, maybe the majority of those who belonged to the UDF, this was just another way of expressing their loyalty to the African National Congress. The UDF was really just the ANC in disguise. Again, that's not for everybody in the UDF, but it was for a significant number. Many of them, for instance, held up Nelson Mandela as their true leader, and called for him to be released from prison, and anticipated that if he was allowed to do that and to enter politics, that he would be the head of the South African state. There were those who remained outside the UDF, however, who were opposed to apartheid, at least in some respect. The most significant of these was the organization called Inkatha. That's Inkatha. This was led by a Zulu chief named Mangosuthu Buthelezi. We'll have some more to say about Buthelezi later. He becomes an important figure in the transition and even in the Mandela presidency. But Buthelezi founded Inkatha in the 1970s when he became the leader of it from that point on for the next 20 plus years. And according to Buthelezi, this was a national liberation movement, much like the ANC. But when Inkatha was examined in its details, it becomes apparent that this was really just an ethnic movement among the Zulu, and especially among the rural Zulu in KwaZulu itself. Right, the Zulus who remained in KwaZulu, who stuck to the farms, who continued to look to the leadership of Buthelezi and to the Zulu king, Goodwill Zwelithini, The Inkatha uh, was their movement. Hamilton, in her book on Shaka Zulu, which we read earlier in the term, comments on this. There's a whole chapter on Buthelezzi's attempts to sort of co-opt the imagery of Shaka Zulu to set himself up as Shaka, and how that becomes fraught as the king doesn't always abide by the wishes of Buthelezi, right? And so this is very much a Zulu movement, and the Zulu were skeptical that the ANC, which was broad and inclusive, but the leadership of which was largely drawn from non-Zulu groups, especially from the Xhosa. Mandela was Xhosa, Tambo, Sisulu, and others. And so Inkatha emerged as a kind of rival to the ANC, and Buthelezi would at times, as we'll see, court the favor of the National Party government, because the National Party was looking for any kind of ally in the 1980s, especially during the state of emergency in the late 1980s, and also during the constitutional negotiations. Buthelezi becomes a real sticking point there. Under the leadership of the UDF, South Africans participated in a series of strikes and boycotts, these at an ever-increasing pace and with larger numbers participating than at any point in South African history. The rhetoric very much was black consciousness. Biko was, his words were often used as the kind of inspiration point for these strikes and boycotts. There were boycotts in the mines and in industry, or rather strikes. There were boycotts of commuter buses, especially when they tried to raise bus fares. There were strikes and protests and even riots against the leadership of the homelands, who were seen as puppets of the apartheid government, and against the township councils, who were chosen. These are the governing bodies chosen by the National Party government. They also were seen as puppets. And there were a mass number of protests and riots in the wake of the 1984 elections. This is after the new constitution was put into place, and these are the elections of the colored and Indian members of parliament. And so there were a lot of protests against that. These protests became increasingly violent. And the violence of the 1980s is something new in South African history. Not that there hadn't been violence before, but the violence takes many forms. There was certainly violence between races, and some of these strikes and protests and things struck out against and damaged or burned or graffitied symbols of the National Party government, symbols of white supremacy. But there was also a good deal of violence between different groups among Africans and coloreds and Indians. Inkatha and the UDF often ran afoul of each other in places where there were a lot of Zulu who were loyal to Inkatha were living. Some of the protests against the homeland leadership and the township councils and other blacks who were seen as colluding with the government were especially violent. The mid-1980s saw the introduction into these protests of a form of execution, kind of vigilante execution called necklacing. And this is a really horrific thing where, they put a tire around a person's neck, fill it with gasoline, and light it on fire. And this became all too common, unfortunately too common in South Africa. I remember when I was living in South Africa watching footage from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which we'll talk about later in the course, and they were showing, some of these protests from the 1980s, and on public television showed a person burning to death, and as this, this was one of the I think informers against the UDF or something, who was working with one of the leaders of the homelands, and they were beating this person while she was burning to death. I mean, it was a really horrific scene to see, but that was the level of violence that was happening in South Africa. And even as a young child, I was 10 years old in 1985. I was aware enough, even living in rural Idaho as I did, of South Africa from just listening to the news that my parents watched, that if somebody had asked me what the most violent country in the world was at the time, almost certainly would have said South Africa, even though I didn't pay a lot of attention to these things, right? It was on the news every single night internationally. We talked about this already. The ANC had, in especially in the from the late 1970s on, adopted a kind of Vietnam strategy. Protesters fleeing police roundups after the Soweto uprising and after some of these violent protests fled all the way out of the country into surrounding nations, into Botswana, into Mozambique, into Swaziland, some of them as far afield as Zambia or Angola. And there were hundreds of them who ended up doing this. They were put into these training grounds run by the ANC and or the South African Communist Party, and they were funded and even supplied with arms to some extent, at least, by the Soviet Union. But and it was in these training grounds that key figures emerged in the resistance movement, like Chris Hani, who was the head at this point of Umkhonto we Sizwe, this militant wing of the ANC, and he was also a member of the South African Communist Party, and Joe Slovo, who was a white man, but a staunch anti-apartheid activist, exiled, lived in Lusaka, I think right next to Oliver Tambo. They were very close compatriots, although they were, Joe Slovo was the head of the South African Communist Party, while Tambo, of course, was an ANC figure. Slovo was very active in training these guerrilla warriors and these saboteurs to target these industrial symbols like the Sasol refinery in Secunda and these other places that we talked about in the earlier lecture. When it came to foreign relations, though, and partly because South Africa was, or rather, because the ANC and the SACP and Umkhonto we Sizwe and POCO and these other militant organizations were so active in waging these campaigns of sabotage, South Africa got very involved in the affairs of its neighbors. And some of this was with the thought, as had been the case since the beginning of the National Party, that South Africa would eventually incorporate all of these surrounding countries into its territory. International opinion had turned decidedly against that, but this did not stop South Africa from messing around with their affairs and trying to destabilize them to the point, or put pressure on them to the point that they would no longer support the ANC, or that they would be so unstable the ANC could not find a home there, right? So they employed a good deal of economic leverage. South Africa was the most productive economy on the African continent by far, and especially regionally, it absolutely dominated. Places like Swaziland and Lesotho, which were surrounded by South Africa, had no hope of having an economy independent of that. The Loti, which is the currency in Lesotho, was tied directly to the currency of the Rand in South Africa. The Pula in Botswana was actually somewhat, well, it was independent of it because Botswana had a lot of diamonds and had a contract with the De Beers Company. And so they had some leverage to become independent, but there was still a great deal of pressure. Tens of thousands of immigrants from these surrounding countries went on a fairly constant basis into South Africa to seek jobs in the factories and the mines. And so this is another method of exerting some economic leverage over them. They forced these countries to abide by certain agreements that would allow the continued flow of labor into South Africa and the continued flow of money out of South Africa via these labor's wages. And then South Africa demonstrated its military superiority by, well, occupying part of Namibia, by sending troops into Angola with the blessing and collusion of the U.S. government, because the Soviets, after the Portuguese left Angola in the mid-70s, the Soviets, in order to prop up the communist-friendly government there, arranged for a lot of troops from Cuba to be sent to Angola and to aid the new government there. South Africa sent its own defense forces into Angola again with the collusion of the United States, to support rebel groups trying to fight against the government in the Angolan Civil War, was spurred on largely by South Africa's involvement in it. Right, so this is an effort to destabilize that place. And something similar happened in Mozambique. The South African Defense Forces supported the resistance movement in Angola, Renamo, as it was the acronym goes, against the newly formed Mozambique government there. And eventually forced the government to expel the ANC from that country. Right. Okay. South Africa probably would have reformed and capitulated under pressure much earlier had it not been for the unflagging or nearly unflagging support of its two most important allies, and that would be the U.S. and the United Kingdom. And it's more than a little shameful that the U.S. was a great supporter of the apartheid government, at least for me as an American. That makes me kind of ill. But and this was not every president and every presidency, so to speak. But so, for instance, Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford were both staunch supporters of the apartheid government. Jimmy Carter was somewhat unfriendly to it, though he did not take any drastic steps to cut funding for South Africa. He did support the arms embargo passed by the UN in 1977. But when Ronald Reagan became president after the 1980 election, he was a great supporter of South Africa. And really, if you look at Reagan's rhetoric about South Africa, which is not, there's a fairly heavy volume of it because South Africa was so constantly in the news in the 1980s. He seems to really have little awareness of what was going on truly in South Africa. He simply saw South Africa as an ally against the spread of communism, and Reagan didn't, it seems, care so much about the racial disparities there. He, in 1985, made a rather embarrassing statement when he said, and I'm just paraphrasing here, that South Africa had done away with the kind of segregation and discrimination that we used to have in the United States, and that they're a model of race relations. This was obviously not something vetted by his speechwriters. This was Reagan, as he did sometimes, going off the cuff and evincing his own absolute ignorance of anything to do with Africa. And this is not an isolated incident, by the way. So Reagan supported the South African government. He vetoed a number of bills that the Congress passed to try to condemn or put pressure on South Africa to reform. Though he was, as we'll see, a couple of those bills eventually overrode him. Reagan's great ally in the fight against communism and in the spread of conservative, or the ascendancy of conservative political philosophy in the 1980s was Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister of the UK. She was also a staunch supporter of the South African government and fought against efforts made by rival parties within Parliament to try to condemn South Africa or put pressure on it to reform its racial policies. International coverage, news coverage, as I said, was frequent, was constant. The footage was shocking. Violence in the streets, in the townships, every single night. This hit the airwaves. The South African government cracked down on coverage, banning any news organization, domestic or foreign, that portrayed stories that were, as they saw it, too unfriendly to the South African government. And so these, the steady flow of this footage was abated to a great extent, but plenty of people still knew about South Africa, knew how unequal the society was, and how reprehensible apartheid was as an institution. In 1986, representatives of several Commonwealth countries — the Commonwealth is an organization of countries, a rather loose organization of countries that were formerly part of the British Empire. South Africa had dropped out of the Commonwealth in the 1960s, but still maintained some economic ties to most of the other countries in it. And this was led by, I believe, the Prime Minister of Australia, or at least maybe it was a former Prime Minister. I can't recall. And they, went to South Africa. They held talks. They called upon the, National Party government to reform its apartheid policies. They seemed to, be making some progress as they saw it. And then while the visitors were still there, the South African Defense Force invaded several other countries to attack ANC targets, all of whom, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, um, were members of the Commonwealth, and the Commonwealth, this contingent, withdrew and issued a very condemning report about South Africa. Right. And with all of that going on, and with UN sanctions being continually put into place and a great deal of pressure being brought to bear, with a movement in the United States calling for sanctions against the apartheid government. This spread like crazy on U.S. college campuses and in other public spaces. This was really one of the great causes of the 1980s. Many American and other foreign companies withdrew from South Africa. A good example of this, that from my own experience, was that even in the mid 1990s, you could get Coca-Cola in South Africa. Coke had never pulled out, but you could not get any Pepsi products there, at least not very easily. Not that I was clamoring for it necessarily, right? But I did find that really interesting. Another company that was not in South Africa when I first arrived there was McDonald's. There was no McDonald's in South Africa. One did open in mid 1995 in Johannesburg. This was a very sort of carefully, I think, calculated move on McDonald's part. They made sure that by this point Mandela was in power. They made sure that the workers there, including the management, reflected the kind of racial demographics of South Africa, right? But yeah, McDonald's opened up its first restaurant there in the mid 90s. And that's kind of hard to believe given how ubiquitous McDonald's is everywhere in the world. But this put a lot of pressure. I mean, this really kind of isolated South Africa and hurt its economy even further. The U.S. government passed a law called the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act in October 1986, overriding the veto of President Reagan with a two-thirds majority in Congress. And this lent further weight to the increased sanctions against the South African government. And even the South African Defense Force began to suffer some setbacks. It lost some battles against Cuban and Angolan troops in Angola in 1988 and 89. And they eventually agreed to a withdrawal from that country, right? So some of its regional power began to wane. And under pressure from the UN and the US and other forces, South Africa agreed to withdraw from Namibia, and the withdrawal was final in 1990. They did, by the way, manage to hold on to some control of Walvis Bay, which was the only major port city in Namibia, but Namibia itself became independent at that point. Now, the apartheid government was getting pressure not only internationally and not only from the resistance calling for the overthrow of apartheid, but also from the white community, the Afrikaners mostly, who felt that the National Party government had made too many concessions to the anti-apartheid movement, right? So further to the right, further to the conservative side of the National Party, there were several groups. And we can trace some of this back to the emergence of a couple of schools of thought. This is part of the rhetoric for decades, actually, that emerged in the 1960s. The two Afrikaans words, verlichtes and verkramptes, with the G's in Afrikaans, you have to hit them really hard in the throat. Okay, if you were wondering why I cleared my throat there. But verlichtes means enlightened, And verkramptes means something like narrow-minded, right? The English word cramped is a cognate of this. Okay. The Verlichtes, as they saw, and I'm pronouncing it with the German accent at this point, Verlichtes, okay. The Verlichtes were those who recognized that apartheid was an untenable system. They didn't necessarily support the full overthrow of it, but they recognized they needed to make some concessions. They still wanted to hold on to white supremacy and white control of government, but they knew they needed to make some changes. The Verkramptes, on the other hand, were committed to the Verwoerdian version of apartheid, or even something stronger than that, right? And so this is the divide among the Afrikaners that really became fundamental in the 1980s. Several members of government, the National Party government, some former ministers, including most especially Andries Treurnicht and Connie Mulder. Connie is, by the way, a male. It's Petrus Cornelius is his name. But Connie Mulder had been, in the 1970s, B.J. Forster's right-hand man. He was being groomed. He was the Home Affairs Minister, which was arguably the most powerful of all of the cabinet positions, besides the Prime Minister himself. And he was being groomed by Forster to take over leadership of the National Party, but was implicated in the scandal that brought down Forster. He then lost an election for the leadership of the National Party to P.W. Botha, and Mulder was taking a back seat at that point. He joined with another former cabinet official, Andries Treurnicht, who became the leader of a new party called the Conservative Party. By the mid-1980s, the Conservative Party had supplanted the Progressive Party as the main opposition to the National Party, though this time they were on the right of the National Party, okay, and felt that the NP had made too many concessions, as I said, to apartheid. The Conservative Party wanted more of the Verwoerdian vision of it. There were parties even further to the right of the Conservative Party, though. The Herstichte Nationaal Party, the reorganized National Party, or the reestablished National Party, or something like that, was wedded to wedded to the vision of a South Africa that expelled all of the blacks to the homelands and was reserved only for the whites, and where Afrikaans was the only official language. That was the kind of the line or the platform of the Herstichte National Party. Even further to the right than the HNP was the AVB, or the AWB. AVB is the Afrikaans pronunciation of that. This was founded in the 1970s by a former policeman named Eugene Terreblanche. Pictured at the bottom of the slide here, the guy at the top is Treurnicht. Terreblanche was let's call him a neo-Nazi, a white supremacist of the highest order. You can see that the AWB adopted as its symbol a swastika-like thing. The red background, the white circle, and then something that looks almost like a swastika. That was the symbol of the AWB. And really, this is more of a paramilitary organization than a real political party, right? Although they were involved in politics and tried. There were members of the AWB who did stand for election at times. Terreblanche and others in this party called for a breakaway Boer republic. Essentially, they wanted to recreate the South African Republic and the Orange Free State of the second half of the 19th century, and expel all non-Afrikaners from that territory and set this up as their national homeland, where there would be only white people speaking Afrikaans. They carried out violent attacks on rival groups, both white and black, mostly black, and really committed a number of acts of terrorism. And so this was a highly militant group organized very much along the lines. I mean, they admired Adolf Hitler and the Nazis and stated that openly. Were organized along kind of fascist paramilitary lines. Okay, so that's the state that South Africa is in by the mid to late 1980s. The National Party, pressured on the one side to reform apartheid or to do away with it entirely. On the other side, pressured by Afrikaners to toe the line, or them forming their own political parties and trying to overthrow the National Party and establish something even more hardline apartheid, or a breakaway state or something like that. And P.W. Botha was caught in the middle of these things. At times he made concessions to the reform camp. At times he catered to the interests of the hardliners. In a speech in 1988, he said, "As for me, I haven't even thought about extending any political rights or the franchise to the blacks." He continued to hold to that line. Making South Africa truly democratic was simply not in his imagination. That was a bridge way too far for him. And so that's kind of where we're going to leave it here. South Africa does declare a state of emergency in 1986, and we need to talk about that as a prelude to the release of Mandela and to the transition period. But we'll do that in the next lecture. Thanks.